The day I entered that county courtroom, my daughter Laura rolled her eyes at her husband as if I were just some bothersome old woman. But when the judge saw me, the world came to a halt. "Mrs. Whitmore," he murmured, his eyes wide, "it's really you." The entire courtroom fell into absolute silence while my daughter and her arrogant husband exchanged panicked glances. But before we continue, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It moves us to discover how far our stories reach. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 70 years old, and until 6 months ago, I was just an ordinary grandmother. Every morning I woke up at 5:30, made my coffee in the old cup my late husband, Robert, had given me for our 30th anniversary, and watered my orchids while I watched the sun rise through the kitchen window. It was a simple, predictable life, yet filled with small joys that kept me tied to the past. For almost 50 years, I was the mother who sacrificed everything for my only daughter, Laura. I worked as a cleaner during the day, a seamstress at night, and on weekends I sold homemade sweets at the local market. All so Laura could attend good schools and have the life I never had. When she married Richard, a man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached his lips, I swallowed my unease and welcomed them for Sunday lunch with my best dishes and a smile that hid my worries. After my husband's death, I had hoped Laura and I would grow closer. How wrong I was. Instead of finding comfort in each other, she began to see me as a burden. Her visits became mechanical, her phone calls rarer. The way she looked at the house where I had raised her, where she had taken her first steps, where we celebrated all her achievements, changed completely. It was no longer a home full of memories, but an asset to be acquired. The greatest disappointment of my life happened on a rainy Tuesday in October. I had prepared cod with potatoes, the recipe Laura had loved as a child. I laid out the embroidered tablecloth I had made when she went off to college, and even bought a fresh flower arrangement for the occasion. When they arrived, Richard walked in without knocking, as if he already owned the house. He flopped into the armchair that had belonged to my Robert and turned on the television without even greeting me. Laura carried a folder of documents and that distant look she had developed in recent years. A look that belonged to a stranger, not the little girl who once held my hand with such trust. "Mom, we need to talk," she said with a cold voice that chilled me to the bone. She sat on the edge of the sofa as if she didn't want to stay long. "Richard and I have decided that this house is too big for you. You can't maintain it on your own anymore." I felt my heart tighten as she continued. "We found an excellent residence for people your age. You'll have company, activities, medical assistance." "But Laura, this is our house," I replied, my voice breaking. "This is where everything we built is, all our memories." Richard cut in without taking his eyes off the television. "Memories are in your head, Mrs. Whitmore, not in the walls. You'll like the residence. It's modern, it has a garden." What he didn't say, but his calculating eyes revealed, was that they wanted my house. The house Robert and I had built with so much sacrifice over decades, the house that held not only our memories but also a part of our souls. Laura placed the folder on the table. "We've already handled all the paperwork, you just need to sign." Her voice was mechanical, as if she were talking about any ordinary contract, not about ripping her own mother away from the only place I had left in the world. When I refused to sign, the mood changed quickly. Richard turned off the television and faced me with a coldness he had never shown so openly before. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, adjusting the expensive tie he wore. "You need to be reasonable. You can't go on living alone. Just last week you left the stove on. It's dangerous." That was a blatant lie. I had never left the stove on in my life. But in that moment, I understood they were willing to invent anything to get what they wanted. In the days that followed, they intensified the pressure. They brought in real estate agents without telling me, strangers measuring my rooms and talking about remodeling potential as if I weren't even there. Laura began packing my things without permission, deciding on her own what I should take and what could be discarded or sold. "This dress is so old, Mom," she said, holding up the blue dress I had worn to my husband's funeral. "You won't need it in the residence." Each object she discarded felt like a piece of my history being torn away. Old photographs, love letters Robert had written to me, the books we read together on winter nights. To Laura and Richard, all of it was just clutter, taking up space in the house they already considered theirs. The final straw came when Laura found my jewelry box. It was a small carved wooden chest Robert had given me on our first wedding anniversary. Inside, along with some pieces of sentimental value, was the pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother. "I'll keep this safe for you," she said, slipping the box into her purse. "Things like this can disappear in a residence." At that moment, I saw something in my daughter's eyes I had never noticed before. Greed. Pure, simple greed disguised as filial concern. And for the first time in my life, I felt a rage I never knew I was capable of feeling. That night, alone in my room, while I listened to Laura and Richard whispering in the living room about how to solve the problem I had become, I cried like I hadn't cried since the death of my husband. But they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of outrage, of rebellion against the injustice of being treated like a disposable object after an entire life of devotion. It was then that I made a decision. I would not leave without a fight. I would not allow them to erase my existence, to reduce me to an inconvenience to be handled. With that newfound determination, I wiped away my tears and began to think about how I could defend myself against those who should have protected me. What I didn't know was that soon I would discover a secret that would completely change the balance of power in that house. A secret my beloved Robert had kept to protect me from exactly a moment like this. The next morning, Laura arrived early with more boxes and renewed determination. "Today we're going to organize Dad's office," she announced, heading toward the room I had kept untouched since Robert passed 3 years ago. "No," I replied with a firmness that surprised her. "That place isn't ready to be touched." "Mom, it's been 3 years," she said impatiently. "We can't keep a shrine forever. The house needs to be prepared for sale." I realized at that moment that it didn't matter what I said. They had already decided my future. The house would be sold with or without my consent. They would find a way to declare me incapable if I didn't cooperate. When Laura went outside to get more boxes from the car, I slipped into the office and locked the door. That was the last refuge of my husband's memory, the place where his scent still lingered in the air, where his belongings remained exactly as he had left them. I ran my fingers across the books on the shelf, the papers meticulously organized in folders, the framed photo of our wedding day. That was when I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. On the bottom shelf of the bookcase, hidden behind a row of old encyclopedias, was a small safe built into the wall. In 47 years of marriage, I had never known of its existence. My hands trembled as I tried to imagine the combination. I tried our wedding date, Robert's birthday, Laura's birth date. Nothing worked. Finally, on impulse, I tried the date we first met, that rainy Sunday afternoon when we had taken shelter under the same bakery awning. To my surprise, the safe opened. Inside was a leather folder with Robert's initials engraved in gold. When I opened it, I found documents that took my breath away. Property deeds, bank statements from accounts I hadn't known existed, stock certificates in well-known companies, insurance policies worth amounts that made my head spin. And in the middle of all of it, an envelope sealed with my name, written in my husband's unmistakable handwriting. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read. "My dear Margaret, if you are reading this letter, it means I am already gone and you have found what I kept to protect your future. Forgive me for keeping our true financial resources a secret all these years. It was not out of mistrust, but out of caution. I always doubted Richard's intentions. There was something about him that worried me from the very beginning, a boundless ambition that made me fear what might happen when I was no longer here to protect you. That is why I built this safety net in silence, investing every extra dollar we managed to save. Everything documented in this folder belongs exclusively to you. Laura will only be entitled to a small portion, and only if she takes care of you with the same love and dedication you always gave her. Otherwise, you have all the power to protect yourself. Use this power wisely, my love. Not for revenge, but to ensure the respect you deserve. Deep down, Laura is a good person, just easily influenced. But if you need to defend yourself, now you have the means to do so. With all my love for eternity, Robert. Tears streamed down my face as I absorbed every word. My Robert, always so discreet, had quietly built an empire to protect me. While I believed we lived modestly, he had been investing in properties, stocks, and businesses that were now worth a fortune. Among the documents, I found something that left me speechless. The deed to the building where Laura and Richard lived. The luxurious apartment they were so proud of that they flaunted as a symbol of their success, in reality, belonged to me. They had been paying rent to a management company that deposited the money directly into an account in my name. An account I hadn't even known existed. There was more. Robert owned stock in the company where Richard worked, not just a few shares, but a significant stake, enough to influence important decisions, even about the future of employees like my son-in-law. Sitting on the office floor, surrounded by papers representing more money than I ever imagined owning, I laughed through my tears. Laura and Richard thought they were throwing me out of my house to take it from me, without any idea that this house was the smallest of my properties. The insistent knocks on the door brought me back to reality. "Mom, open this door right now," Laura shouted. Quickly, I tucked the most important documents into my purse and returned the rest to the safe, closing it carefully. When I opened the door, my daughter looked at me with irritation. "What were you doing locked in here?" "Just saying goodbye," I replied with a calmness that unsettled her. "You're right, Laura. Maybe it's time to move on." She studied me with suspicion, but then her face softened, convinced I had finally given in. "I'm glad you understand, Mom. You'll see this is the best thing for everyone." "Yes," I nodded, clutching my purse tightly, where I had hidden the documents that would change everything. "I'm sure everyone will get exactly what they deserve." That night, while Laura and Richard celebrated their apparent victory with a bottle of expensive wine in the living room, I made a call to a number I found among Robert's contacts, Attorney Susan Miller. "Attorney Miller, my name is Margaret Whitmore, widow of Robert Whitmore. I need your help with some urgent matters related to my inheritance." When I hung up the phone, I looked at Robert's photograph on the nightstand and smiled. "You always knew, didn't you, my dear? You always knew this day would come." For the first time in months, I slept deeply, not with the resignation of someone who had been defeated, but with the calm of someone who had finally found her strength. Attorney Susan Miller was exactly as Robert had described her in his notes, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. When I entered her office 3 days later, she had already reviewed the copies of the documents I had emailed and prepared a preliminary strategy. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said after offering me a coffee, "your husband was extremely meticulous. All the documents are in order, the investments were made legally, and the will is absolutely incontestable. You are, without question, a very wealthy woman." Those words sounded strange to me, someone who had always lived counting pennies to make it to the end of the month. But the attorney continued, showing me a detailed report of all my assets. "The most interesting part," she observed, "is that your husband structured everything in a way that your daughter and son-in-law cannot contest. The behavior clause in the will is particularly clever. They would only be entitled to a portion of the estate if they cared for you with love and respect. Considering what you told me about their attempts to remove you from your own home, we can easily argue that this clause has been violated." "What should I do now?" I asked, still trying to absorb the magnitude of the situation. Susan leaned forward with a determined glint in her eyes. "First, do not sign absolutely anything they put in front of you. Second, I need you to maintain the appearance that you have discovered nothing. The more they expose themselves, the better for our case. And as for the house, let them think they have won for now. Pretend you are considering the move to the residence. Ask to visit the place, question the costs. The more they reveal, the more ammunition we will have." In the weeks that followed, I followed Susan's instructions to the letter. I allowed Laura and Richard to continue with their plans, pretending resignation, while secretly documenting every conversation, every veiled threat, every attempt to belittle me or make me seem incapable. Richard even brought a doctor friend to evaluate my mental condition, a man who barely examined me before suggesting I might be developing dementia. I recorded the entire fraudulent consultation on my phone, just as Susan had advised. Laura, for her part, intensified her efforts to empty the house. Boxes and more boxes of my memories were packed, labeled, and sent off for donation or simply thrown away. It hurt to see my life treated with such contempt, but I stayed strong, knowing that each of their actions only strengthened my case. One afternoon, while Laura cataloged my belongings in the living room, I let slip a piece of information as if it were nothing. "You know, Laura, I was thinking of giving you my pearl necklace before moving to the residence. It was your grandmother's after all." She stopped what she was doing, visibly interested. "The pearl necklace? The one you kept in a little wooden box?" "Yes, but I can't seem to find it. Have you seen it anywhere?" Laura flushed slightly. "No, I don't know what you're talking about." "That's strange," I continued with apparent innocence. "I also can't find the sapphire earrings your father gave me on our 40th anniversary. I hope they haven't been lost in the packing." I saw the discomfort in her eyes, the brief moment of guilt that was quickly replaced by a poorly constructed excuse about having put my jewelry in a safe place. Later, I reported that conversation to Susan, who smiled with satisfaction. "Perfect. We are building a solid case of asset abuse." The decisive moment came when, following her advice, I asked to visit the supposed residence before making my final decision. Laura and Richard took me on a Sunday to show me a place that looked more like a warehouse for the elderly than the paradise they had promised. Tiny rooms, overworked employees, and a smell of disinfectant that barely masked the stench of urine in the air. "Isn't it wonderful, Mom?" Laura asked with forced enthusiasm. "Look, it even has a community TV room." I looked at the depressing room, where half a dozen elderly people stared at an old television set, and felt my stomach turn. "How much does this place cost?" I asked. Richard answered immediately. "Don't worry about that. We'll sell your house and the money will be more than enough to cover the costs for many years." "And what if I live longer than the money?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They hadn't thought of that, or worse, they had thought of it and didn't care. On the way back home, I remained silent while they animatedly discussed their plans to remodel the house as soon as I was gone. They talked about tearing down walls, modernizing the kitchen, and transforming my bedroom into an office for Richard. "And what about Dad's room?" I asked suddenly. Laura hesitated. "Well, we were thinking of turning it into a guest room, or maybe a bigger walk-in closet." "I see," I replied, looking out the car window to hide the pain in my eyes. That night, I called Susan and said, "I'm ready. Let's move forward with the plan." 2 days later, Laura and Richard showed up with the final papers for the transfer of the house and my admission to the residence. A man in a suit accompanied them, their so-called lawyer, who I later discovered was just a friend of Richard's who worked as a real estate consultant. "Mom, we brought you the documents to sign," Laura announced, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "As soon as you sign here and here, we can finalize your move to the residence. We already reserved a spot for next week." I looked at the papers calmly, pretending to study them, when the doorbell rang. "Who could that be?" Richard asked, irritated by the interruption. "It must be my friend Margaret," I answered innocently. "I asked her to come help me with some things." When Richard opened the door, it wasn't Margaret who entered, but attorney Susan Miller, accompanied by a court officer and a social worker. "Good afternoon," she said with a professional smile. "I am attorney Susan Miller, legal representative of Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. We are here for an official visit regarding a report of attempted fraud and elder abuse." Laura's face drained of all color, while Richard struggled to maintain his composure. "There must be some mistake," he said, extending his hand, which Susan ignored completely. "We are only helping my mother-in-law move to a place more appropriate for her age." "Interesting," Susan replied, pointing to the papers on the table. Then I can assume these documents were reviewed by an independent lawyer representing Mrs. Whitmore's interests. The silence was deafening. I would also like to inform you, Susan continued, that we have reason to believe that jewelry and valuables belonging to Mrs. Whitmore were removed from this residence without her authorization. The court officer has a warrant to verify those items. It was then that I saw something I will never forget. The exact moment my daughter realized her plan was falling apart. Her eyes widened in panic, then narrowed in anger, and finally filled with tears as the truth caught up with her. "Mom," she whispered, "what did you do?" I stood slowly, feeling a strength I never knew I possessed. What did I do, Laura? I defended myself, just as your father knew one day I would have to. The court officer and the social worker began documenting the state of the house, photographing the stacked boxes, the half-emptied rooms, the unsigned transfer papers on the table. Susan remained at my side, a calm and authoritative presence that radiated confidence. "Mrs. Whitmore," the social worker asked, "do you feel coerced into leaving your residence against your will?" "Yes," I replied firmly. "My daughter and my son-in-law have pressured me for months, even threatening to declare me mentally incapable if I didn't agree to go to a nursing home." Laura stepped forward, indignant. "This is absurd. We are only trying to take care of her. She's confused. She's forgotten things. She left the stove on." "Interesting," Susan interrupted, pulling a small device from her pocket. "I have here recordings from the last 2 months that contradict that statement, including a conversation where Mr. Richard admits to inventing the stove incident to convince Mrs. Laura that her mother could not live alone." Richard turned pale. "That's illegal. You can't record people without consent." "Actually," Susan smiled, "Mrs. Whitmore recorded conversations in her own home, where she has every right to protect her interests. In addition, we have recent medical reports attesting to her full mental capacity, prepared by independent professionals, not by doctor friends brought in by Mr. Richard." The social worker took notes on his clipboard while the court officer continued his meticulous work. Laura collapsed into a chair, crying openly. "But Mom, why are you doing this to us? We're your family." "Family?" I repeated, feeling a mix of sadness and indignation. Was it as family that you packed my memories as if they were trash? Was it as family that you took your grandmother's jewelry without permission? Was it as family that you and Richard planned to abandon me in a second-rate nursing home just to keep my house?" "That's not true. She sobbed. "Richard convinced me it was best for you. He said you were losing your memory, that it was dangerous for you to live alone." "And you believed him instead of trusting your own mother?" I asked, feeling my heart break all over again. "Do you know me so little?" Richard, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, tried to regain authority. "This is a misunderstanding we can resolve within the family. We don't need lawyers or court officers. Mrs. Whitmore, we have always wanted the best for you, the best." Susan intervened. "Like the attempts to transfer the ownership of the house into Mrs. Laura's name even before Mrs. Whitmore moved to the residence? Or the unauthorized withdrawals from Mrs. Whitmore's bank account in recent months?" Laura's eyes widened. "I don't know what she's talking about, Mom. I swear I didn't take your money." "No, you didn't take it," I replied calmly. "But Richard did. I have bank statements showing transfers made with my card into your joint account on dates when I wasn't even home." Richard adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake at all," I continued, feeling a strange calm as I turned toward them. "Just as it's no mistake that you thought I was a poor, defenseless old woman, easy to manipulate and discard. But there's something you don't know." I walked slowly to my purse and pulled out a folder of documents Susan had prepared for me. "Your father, Laura, was not just the quiet accountant you knew. He built a financial empire in silence over the years and left it all to you. I laid on the table property deeds, stock certificates, bank statements with figures that made Richard's eyes widen in disbelief and greed. "This building on Fifth Avenue," I pointed to one of the deeds, "is mine, as well as the land on the coast you visited last summer, believing it belonged to your boss, Richard." Laura took the papers with trembling hands. "This can't be true." "It is true," Susan confirmed. "And there's more. The apartment where you live also belongs to Mrs. Whitmore. You pay rent to a management company that deposits the money directly into an account in her name." Richard staggered as if he had been punched. "This is impossible." "And those shares in the company where you work, Richard, the ones purchased by an anonymous investor 5 years ago that secured your promotion, those are also mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Laura looked at me as if she were seeing a ghost. "Why didn't Dad ever tell us?" she asked in a barely audible voice. "Because he didn't trust Richard's intentions, and, as it turns out, he was right to be cautious." Richard tried one last desperate move. "Mrs. Whitmore, we can work this out. Obviously there was some misunderstanding. We didn't know about these resources. We were only worried about your safety. If you have so many means, we can find you a better place, a more luxurious one." "I'm not interested in any better place," I replied firmly. "This is my house, and here is where I will stay." "And what about our apartment?" Laura asked, tears running down her face. "Are you going to evict us?" "That depends," I answered with a mix of sorrow and determination, "on how much you are willing to learn about respect, dignity, and true love." Then Susan spoke. "In the meantime, I have here a temporary court order preventing either of you from removing any more items from this house or attempting to transfer its ownership. We are also requesting the immediate return of all items already removed, especially family jewelry and personal documents." Laura collapsed in sobs while Richard remained frozen, trying to process the information. The court officer continued his work, meticulously photographing every room, every document, every piece of evidence of what had occurred. "I suggest," Susan said firmly, "that the two of you leave now and think very carefully about your next steps. We are prepared to take this case forward with full legal consequences unless we reach an agreement that fully respects Mrs. Whitmore's rights and wishes." Richard finally found his voice, but he was no longer the arrogant man I knew. There was fear in his eyes. "How much? How much is all this worth?" he asked, pointing at the documents. Susan smiled coldly. "Much more than you could ever pay in an entire lifetime of work, Mr. Richard. Now I suggest you leave." When the door closed behind them, I felt my legs give way. Susan supported me to the sofa, where I collapsed, emotionally exhausted. "You were very brave," she said, sitting beside me. "Not everyone would have the strength to confront their own family that way." "I don't know if it was courage or desperation," I confessed, glancing at the social worker who was still taking notes. "I never wanted to reach this point." "Unfortunately," Susan replied, "it is often the ones we love the most who hurt us the deepest. But now you are in control. What do you want to do next?" I looked around the living room, at the walls that had witnessed so many moments of my life, at the empty spaces where once there had been photographs and memories. "I want to recover my things," I replied firmly. "And then I want Laura to understand exactly what she did, not for revenge, but because she needs to learn." In the days that followed, I received desperate calls from my daughter. At first, I ignored them all, following Susan's advice to keep my distance until the legal matters were resolved. Richard, on the other hand, disappeared completely. I learned he had requested a leave of absence from work and traveled to take care of personal matters. 1 week after the confrontation, Susan brought me news. "We received a settlement proposal," she said, handing me a folder. "Your son-in-law is willing to return all your possessions, publicly acknowledge that you are fully competent, and renounce any claim to your house or estate." "And what does he want in return?" I asked, knowing Richard's character too well to believe in sincere remorse. "That you do not use your influence as a shareholder to harm him at the company, and that you do not evict him from the apartment immediately." He is asking for 6 months to find another place. I considered the proposal for a moment. And Laura, what does she say about this? Susan hesitated. Your daughter did not participate in the negotiation. From what I understood, there are tensions in the marriage after the revelation. That did not surprise me. Richard had always been the kind of man to abandon ship when it started to sink. Now that he knew he would not get my fortune, he was surely already blaming Laura for the failure of the plan. Tell Richard I accept his conditions with one caveat, I replied after a moment's thought. If he wants to stay in the apartment for 6 months, he will have to increase the rent by 50%. After all, now he knows who the real owner is. Susan smiled. It will be a pleasure to deliver your message. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected visit. Laura was at my door, alone, with deep circles under her eyes and a face marked by sleepless nights. May I come in? She asked timidly, so different from the arrogant woman who had tried to throw me out of my own house. I opened the door silently and let her in. She carried 2 large boxes, which she carefully placed on the living room table. Your jewelry, she said in a trembling voice. All of it. And also your photo albums, Dad's letters, everything I took. I opened the first box, and there were the treasures of my life intact. My mother's pearl necklace, the earrings Robert had given me, the engagement ring with the small sapphire for which he had saved for a year. Richard and I, Laura spoke abruptly, breaking the silence. We have separated. He blamed me for everything. He said I should have noticed that Dad would never have lived so modestly if he didn't have something hidden. I did not answer. I simply continued reviewing the contents of the boxes, making sure everything was there. Mom, she continued with a trembling voice, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. What we did, what I allowed to be done, is unforgivable. But I need you to know that I really believed I was doing the right thing. Finally, I lifted my eyes to her. And the right thing was to drive me out of my house? Discard my memories like trash? Treat me like a senile old woman? No, Laura admitted, tears running freely down her face. Richard convinced me you were getting worse, that it was dangerous for you to live alone. He made up stories about you forgetting things, leaving the stove on. And I believed him instead of trusting my own mother. Why, Laura? I asked, feeling the weight of decades of love seemingly wasted. After everything I did for you, after all the sacrifices, how could you believe I deserved to be treated that way? She sat down on the sofa, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Because it was easier, she finally confessed. It was easier to believe you needed help than to admit I had married a man who only cared about money and status. It was easier to pretend we were taking care of you than to face the truth about what we had become. Her face twisted with genuine shame. When Richard first suggested we sell the house, I said no. Then he started planting doubts in my head, little seeds of worry about your mental health, about your ability to live alone. And I let those seeds grow because deep down, I wanted the house. I wanted to transform it, modernize it, erase the marks of the past that made me feel guilty for not being the daughter I should have been. Her words struck me like a revelation. It wasn't just greed, it was guilt. The desire to erase the evidence of everything I had done for her, everything she had failed to give back. And now? I asked. What do you want from me, Laura? She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, just as she had done when she was a little girl. Nothing. I don't deserve anything from you. I only came to return what is yours and to tell you that, even if you never forgive me, I know what I did, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a better person. I looked at my daughter. Despite everything, she was still my daughter. And I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Honesty. Not the calculated manipulation Richard had perfected, nor the false concern of recent months, but genuine vulnerability. Where are you living? I asked. With a friend for now. I'm looking for a small apartment I can afford with my salary. I nodded, absorbing the information. And the apartment? Richard stayed there. She answered bitterly. He took almost everything in the separation settlement. He said it was the least I could do after ruining our plans. I couldn't help but smile ironically. Richard was still Richard to the very end. Laura, I finally said, I can't promise things will ever go back to how they were. You broke something deep between us, and it will take time, if it ever happens at all, to rebuild that trust. She nodded, accepting my words without protest. But, I continued, your father believed that, deep down, you were still the girl he raised. He believed you could find your way back to the person you were meant to be. Dad was always better at seeing the good in people than I was, she murmured. Yes, I agreed. And maybe I need to learn to have a little more of that faith. I didn't forgive her that day. I didn't invite her back home or promise to forget what had happened. But when she stood to leave, I didn't stop her from hugging me briefly, a timid, uncertain contact filled with as much regret as hope. After she left, I remained alone with my recovered jewelry and the pain of a betrayal still fresh. But for the first time in months, I also felt something different. Not just the satisfaction of having defended myself, but the possibility, however remote, of healing. 2 weeks after Laura's visit, I received an unexpected call from Susan. Mrs. Whitmore, a situation has come up that you should know about. Richard didn't pay the increased rent as agreed, and from what I know, he is planning to leave the country. Leave the country? Where? Apparently he has a cousin in Spain. My sources at his company indicate he resigned and is already selling his belongings. That didn't surprise me. Richard had always been the type to run when things got tough. What did surprise me was what Susan added afterward. There is something else. Laura came to me yesterday asking for legal help. She discovered that Richard emptied their joint accounts before the separation and left her with debts in her name. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. Despite everything, it was my daughter who was suffering. What is she planning to do? We are filing injunctions to prevent him from leaving the country without resolving his obligations, but I honestly believe he already transferred the money abroad. Laura is practically bankrupt, in addition to being in debt. After hanging up, I stood for a long time at the window, looking out at the garden where my daughter used to play as a child. I remembered Robert's letter and his words about using power not to hurt, but to protect and to teach. The next day, I asked Susan to prepare some documents and called Laura. We need to talk, I said simply. She arrived on time, dressed in simple clothes I had never seen her wear before. The glamour of an executive's wife had vanished completely. Susan told me about Richard, I began as soon as we sat down. About the debts, the money, everything. Laura nodded resignedly. He planned it all months ago. While we pretended to care about you, he was already preparing his escape. I was so stupid, Mom, so blind. Many intelligent women are deceived by men like Richard, I replied. Don't blame yourself for that. Blame yourself for what you did to me, not for what he did to you. She lowered her eyes, accepting the harsh truth in my words. I have a proposal for you, I continued, sliding a folder across the table. It's not charity or automatic forgiveness. It's an opportunity. Laura opened the folder cautiously, and her eyes widened as she read the contents. Is this an employment contract? Yes, for the Whitmore Foundation, an organization I am creating to help elderly people who are victims of family abuse and abandonment. The idea had been born in my sleepless nights when I realized my story was not unique. How many elders were being manipulated by greedy relatives? How many were forced to leave their homes, to give up their lives, without the luck I had of a cautious husband? You want me to work for you? She asked, confused. I want you to work for the foundation. Your knowledge of administration will be useful. The salary is modest but fair, and there is a housing clause. You can occupy the small apartment at the back of this house, which will save you rent while you reorganize your life. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for me? After everything? I stood and walked to the window, watching my garden bloom under the afternoon sun. I am not doing it for you, Laura. I am doing it for the woman you can become, for the daughter your father believed you still were deep down. And I am doing it for all the elderly who were not as fortunate as I was, who have no way to defend themselves. I turned back to face her. Your work will be hard and often painful. You will hear stories that remind you of what you tried to do to me. You will have to look into the eyes of people betrayed by those who were supposed to love them, and maybe, through that work, you will truly understand what you tried to do. Laura held the contract with trembling hands. I don't know if I deserve this opportunity. You probably don't deserve it, I answered honestly. But your father always said, forgiveness is not something one deserves. It is something that is offered. I am not ready to fully forgive you, but I am willing to offer you a path. In the months that followed, I transformed my pain into purpose. With Susan's help, I created the Whitmore Foundation, using part of the fortune my husband had accumulated to defend those who could not defend themselves. We bought a large house near mine and turned it into a center of legal and emotional support for elderly people in vulnerable situations. Laura, true to her word, worked tirelessly. At first, the other employees of the foundation treated her with suspicion. Everyone knew our story, which I never tried to hide, but over time her genuine dedication began to earn respect. The path of redemption was not easy for her. There were days when she came home. The small apartment at the back of my garden had become her home. With red eyes from crying after listening to particularly painful stories of abandoned or exploited elders. How can you look at me every day knowing what I tried to do? She asked one night in the shared kitchen. Because I see that you are trying to change, I simply replied, and because your father believed you could be better. Richard never returned. We learned, through the foundation's contacts, that he had settled in Spain and was already involved with another woman, a wealthy widow, by coincidence or by pattern. Part of me wondered if I should warn her, but another part knew that some predators are only stopped when they meet a prey that bites back. 1 year after the creation of the foundation, I received unexpected recognition, a Human Rights Award for our work with vulnerable seniors. On the day of the ceremony, as I prepared to give my speech, I looked at the audience and saw Laura in the front row, applauding with tears in her eyes. That night, as we walked through my garden, our garden as it was beginning to feel, Laura handed me a small package. What is this? I asked. Open it, she replied nervously. Inside was a handcrafted book. On its pages, Laura had pasted old family photographs, many of the same ones she had carelessly packed away a year earlier. But now each one was accompanied by a handwritten letter, recalling the moment captured and reflecting on its meaning. I spent months searching for these photos, she explained. Some were with Richard, others with friends to whom I had given them without thinking. I wanted to gather our memories again, not to erase them, but to honor them. I leafed through the book carefully, feeling the weight of decades of family history in my hands. On the last page was a recent photo of the foundation, with the entire team gathered in front of the building, and below it a simple inscription. For my mom, who taught me it is never too late to start over. And for my dad, who always knew I would find my way back. That night, for the first time in over a year, I embraced my daughter without reservation. It was not complete forgiveness. Some wounds are too deep to ever fully heal. But it was a beginning. A recognition that we were both changing, growing, learning to be family again, this time built on mutual respect rather than obligation. As we gazed at the stars from our shared garden, I thought of Robert and how he had planned all of this. Not just financial protection, but also the possibility of redemption. He knew our daughter better than either of us. He knew she could lose her way, but also that she could find her way back to the light. And as the stars shone above us, I felt he was right. 18 months after the creation of the foundation, I received news that would change everything again. One of the volunteer attorneys approached me with a grave expression. Mrs. Whitmore, we found something you should see, he said, handing me a folder. During our investigation for Mrs. Olivia's case, we discovered the same scheme was used against several other elderly women. And guess who is behind it? I opened the folder and felt my blood run cold. There was Richard, using another name, but unmistakable in the surveillance photographs. He had secretly returned to Spain and was running a sophisticated scheme to deceive elderly widows, making them sign documents that transferred their properties to shell companies. "He's back," I murmured, "and he is doing the same thing to other women." The attorney nodded grimly. "We have already informed the authorities, but we need someone who knows him to make a formal identification. Someone who can testify about his methods and his personality." That night, I spoke to Laura about the discovery. She turned pale when she saw the photographs and documents. "He hasn't changed at all," she said bitterly. "He just found new victims." "The authorities want us to testify against him," I explained. "I have already decided I will go, but you do not have to involve yourself if you do not want to." Laura looked at me with a determination that reminded me of myself. "No, Mom, I need to do this. Not just for us, but for all those women." In the following weeks, we worked with the police and the district attorney's office, providing detailed testimonies about Richard's methods. The subtle manipulations, the small lies that escalated into full frauds. Laura was crucial in explaining how he had convinced her to participate in the plan against me, how he planted doubts and insecurities, how he gradually isolated his victims. When the day of the trial arrived, I felt an anxiety I had not experienced since the confrontation in my own house. The courtroom was full. Our case had drawn the attention of the media, partly because of the Foundation's work, already recognized nationwide for fighting financial abuse of the elderly. As I entered the courtroom with Laura by my side, I felt all eyes on us. Richard's most recent victims sat together, women between 65 and 85 years old, all with stories painfully similar to mine. Richard was brought in handcuffed, wearing a worn suit that contrasted with the elegance he had always displayed. When our eyes met, I saw a flash of rage that quickly turned into that mask of calculated charm I knew so well. The decisive moment came when the judge entered the room. My heart nearly stopped when I recognized him. "Judge David Reynolds," announced the court officer. He was the young attorney who had once worked as an intern at the court decades earlier, when I had been a secretary there. The same shy boy to whom I brought coffee on the nights he stayed late studying for exams. He did not recognize me immediately, occupied with the opening procedures. But when it was my turn to testify and I stated my name, I saw him look up from his papers with an expression of surprise and recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "Isabel Whitmore? From the regional court clerk's office?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied with a small smile. "It has been a long time." The judge smiled briefly before recovering his professional expression. "It certainly has. Please continue with your testimony." For the next 2 hours, I recounted in detail everything Richard had done, how he had manipulated my daughter, how he had tried to strip me of my home and my dignity, how he had planned to abandon me in a substandard nursing facility. I spoke of the discovery of the fortune my husband had left, and how that had ruined Richard's plans. "And now," I concluded, "he is doing the same thing to other women who were not fortunate enough to have a cautious husband like mine." When I finished, Richard's attorney rose for cross-examination, trying to portray me as a confused old woman who had imagined persecution where there had only been family concern. "Mrs. Whitmore," she asked with false sympathy, "is it not true that you experienced memory lapses at that time? That you sometimes forgot where you put things? That you left the stove on?" "No," I replied firmly. "I never had such problems. Your client invented those stories to convince my daughter that I needed to be institutionalized." "And how can you be so certain of that if you had memory issues?" she pressed with a condescending smile. "Objection, Your Honor," the prosecutor intervened. "Sustained. Counselor, rephrase your question," ordered Judge Wallace. But before she could, I asked permission to respond. "The attorney asks how I can be certain. I can be certain because I have complete medical reports carried out after my son-in-law's attempt to declare me incompetent. I can be certain because I have recordings of him admitting that he invented those incidents. And I can be certain because, at 70 years old, I still remember perfectly the first day when the now Judge David Reynolds entered the courthouse as an intern, wearing a navy blue suit too big in the shoulders and carrying a faux leather briefcase his mother had given him at graduation. The entire courtroom fell silent. The judge looked at me with a mixture of surprise and emotion. I remember every detail of that day, just as I remember every detail of the moment when my son-in-law and my daughter tried to convince me that I was no longer capable of caring for myself. My memory, counselor, is perfectly intact. The silence was broken only by the sound of the judge's pen as he made notes in his book. Laura testified next with a courage that filled me with pride. She spoke openly about how she had been manipulated, about her guilt and regret, about the path of redemption she had found through the foundation. Richard convinced me that my mother was losing her mental capacity, she explained, her voice breaking. It started with small suggestions. Did you notice how your mother forgot that actor's name? Did you see how she mixed up the dates? Until I began to see problems that did not exist. When Richard testified, it was like watching an actor on stage. He denied everything, painted himself as a concerned son-in-law, even pretended to cry as he spoke of his pain. But then the prosecutor presented the evidence, recordings, falsified documents, testimonies from other victims with stories almost identical to mine, and finally bank records that proved how he had siphoned money from all of them. After 3 days of trial, Judge David Reynolds pronounced the sentence. Richard Collins, this court finds you guilty of all charges of fraud, falsification of documents, coercion, and abuse against vulnerable seniors. You exploited the trust of women who, in their golden years, deserve respect and protection, not manipulation and theft. The most disturbing part is the cold calculation with which you planned and carried out your crimes, targeting those you believe to be weak and defenseless. The judge paused, then firmly concluded. For these crimes, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison, along with full restitution to the victims and a fine proportionate to the damage caused. As Richard was escorted out, the judge looked at me and made a small gesture of recognition that almost no one noticed, but that meant everything to me. Proof that small acts of kindness, like encouraging a young intern decades ago, can return when most needed. Outside, we were surrounded by reporters and elderly women seeking hope. One woman, about 80 years old, approached me in tears. You gave me courage. After seeing you in the paper, I realized my nephew was doing the same thing to me. Thanks to you, I stopped him in time. That night, Laura and I sat in the garden with a bottle of wine, celebrating not only the legal victory, but also the journey we had traveled together. Do you know what's most ironic? She said, gazing at the stars. If Richard had never tried to take your house, the foundation never would have existed. Your father always said that even in the worst situations, you can find purpose, I replied, and I believe he was right. Laura smiled, a clean, genuine smile, the same she had as a child. He would be proud of you, Mom, of everything you built out of pain. Of both of us, I corrected softly. He always knew you would find your way back. 5 years passed since that trial. The Margaret Whitmore Foundation became a national leader in defending the rights of the elderly. What began as a small legal support office expanded to 3 cities, offering legal aid, psychological support, social activities, and, more recently, temporary housing for seniors in vulnerable situations. One spring morning, I was sitting in the foundation's garden, watching a Tai Chi class when Laura approached with an envelope in her hand. It came today, she said, handing it to me with excitement. I think it's what we've been waiting for. With trembling hands, at 75 years old, I opened the envelope sealed by the Department of Justice in Washington. It has been approved, I announced with a lump in my throat. The Whitmore Bill for the protection of the financial and psychological well-being of vulnerable seniors was passed yesterday. Laura sat beside me, tears shining in her eyes. We did it, Mom. We really did it. The bill, the result of 3 years of work alongside lawmakers and organizations, created stronger legal mechanisms to protect people over 65 against financial and psychological abuse, especially when the perpetrators were their own relatives. As I embraced my daughter in that garden full of life, I knew all the pain had found a purpose. It was the culmination of everything we had learned from our own painful experience, transformed into a tool to prevent thousands of seniors from suffering the same ordeal. "Your father would be so proud," I murmured, carefully placing the letter back in its envelope. "Not only of us, but of how our mission allowed us to create something much bigger than ourselves." Laura took my wrinkled hand in hers. At 50 years old, she had become a strong, compassionate woman, completely different from the manipulated and insecure person who had once nearly forced me out of my own home. Her work at the foundation had transformed her, just as it had transformed me. "I have something to show you," she said, helping me to my feet. "A surprise we've been preparing for the foundation's anniversary celebration." We walked together to the new wing of the main building, which had been closed for weeks for renovations. Laura opened the door and led me inside. The walls, once bare, were now covered with photographs, dozens of them, carefully framed. They were faces of seniors we had helped over the years, each accompanied by a small plaque with their story. "This is the Hall of Stories," Laura explained. "We want everyone who visits the foundation to see their faces and learn their lives, to understand that every elder is not just a case, but a complete story of experiences, memories, and dignity." In the center of the main wall, there was an empty space, reserved for a larger portrait. "And here," she continued, "will go your photograph, Mom, with the story that started all of this." I felt my eyes fill with tears. I don't know if I deserve a place like that. After all, I was lucky. Many others never had the protection Robert left me. "That's exactly why your story must be told," she insisted. "To show that resistance is possible, that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, and that even the worst betrayals can lead to something good." We walked slowly down the corridor, stopping to read some of the plaques. Mrs. Olivia, 82, who reclaimed her house after her nephew tried to sell it without her consent. Mr. Robert, 77, who escaped an abusive marriage after decades of psychological manipulation. Mrs. Carmen, 90, who reported her children for misappropriation and now gives lectures on financial independence in old age. "All these people," Laura said, "found their voice because you found yours first." That night I returned to my home, the same one I had almost lost 5 years earlier. Laura now lived in a small house near the foundation, but we often had dinner together, and every Sunday she joined me for breakfast, reviving a tradition we had lost during the dark years. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, looking at the garden Robert had loved so much, now more beautiful than ever. The orchids bloomed in abundance under my care, even if my hands had grown slower with age. I thought about how my life had changed. From the near tragedy of losing my home and my dignity came a purpose I never imagined. And from the betrayal of my only daughter came a reconciliation deeper and truer than any relationship we had before. On the table beside me was the jewelry box Laura had once tried to take, now returned and restored. I opened it and touched my mother's pearl necklace. Tomorrow I would wear it at the foundation's anniversary ceremony, where the Whitmore bill would be officially announced. A small envelope at the bottom of the box caught my attention. Inside was a handwritten note from Laura. "Mom, I will never be able to erase the pain I caused, but I hope to be worthy of the second chance you gave me. Every day at the foundation reminds me that our work is not only about laws and rights, but about restoring the dignity so many try to take from the elderly. Thank you for teaching me that it is never too late to start again, never too late to do what is right." I placed the note back in the jewelry box, feeling a deep peace. The next morning, as I prepared for the ceremony, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The white hair I wore with pride, the wrinkles marking a face that had known as much pain as joy, and eyes that had cried many tears but now shone with purpose. I thought about what I would say to other women my age. It is never too late to stand up for yourself. It is never too late to turn pain into purpose. And it is never too late to discover your own strength, even when those who should protect you try to destroy you. When I arrived at the foundation, a crowd greeted me with smiles. Our team, seniors we had helped, officials, and supporters. In the center stood Laura, now the executive director, waiting for me with a sincere embrace. As I stepped onto the stage and began my speech, I looked at all those people and felt grateful for everything, even the darkness of the past years, because without it, I never would have discovered the light that now illuminated so many lives. My name is Isabel, I began, adjusting the microphone. I am 75 years old, and this is the story of how I almost lost everything, only to find a purpose greater than I ever imagined. When I finished, applause filled the hall. I looked toward the sky through the windows and smiled. Do you see, Robert? I thought. You were right about everything. And now, if this story touched your heart, click on the next video appearing on your screen, because there you will discover a story of betrayal and an unexpected twist like you have never seen before.